Commissioner Bratton, law enforcement professionals. As I was preparing for the words to say today, I thought back to when I was a kid. And I thought back to those times when we would walk to or sometimes run to a precinct or a police department. I thought back to that time when we were outside a Yankee Stadium, and we were in the old Yankee Stadium, and we were in one of those Kinney parking garages in our car. And then I thought back, I was born in Newark, New Jersey, and then we moved around a lot because the rent was never paid. So I thought back to all those apartments that we lived in, and all those like second floor walk-ups. And I thought about all those times when you came to rescue us. In particular, when you came to rescue me. When a law enforcement professional came, when a police officer came. And I thought to myself as I was preparing for today, you know, I was just a little kid at that time, right? I was just like in childhood. We think of children as children, but the reality is they're just adults in waiting. We grow up. And I thought to myself that I never said the words that were in my heart when I was little to any of those officers. I just kind of stood there, scared but happy they came. So now it's like 30 some odd years later, and I get to say some of those words. Thank you. You know, to us, and to me in particular, you were my hero. You know, I so appreciate you being there. I don't know how many children you hear that from who grew up living with domestic violence. I don't know how many adults you hear from who grew up living with domestic violence, who say that to you. But for all of us, I want to say thank you very much. You know, I spent the past 7 years researching and working on a problem that touched me and my family. I wanted to understand it better for us, but really I wanted to better understand it for anyone else who experienced something similar, or for anyone else who cares that someone did. So when you think about those two groups, in this room I believe there are two groups of people. You either experienced personally some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, or you care that someone else did. There's no other way you can be in this room. So this is really about we. And I came across over the past 7 years the work of researchers, the vast majority of which has only been made available in the past couple decades. And I came across the stories of others. And that research and those stories, when coupled with my own experience, fundamentally changed my life. It changed the way I view this problem and instilled in me a very deep desire to make certain that anyone who experienced something similar to what I experienced, or anyone who cares that someone else did, has access to what I now know to be the truth. Because the thing is, most don't know it to be the truth. But the moment they do, the moment that they're aware, and that they understand and they share, in that moment, things begin to change. But that moment is not happening right now. It really is the lack of awareness and understanding and sharing. This is the common enemy. Now, you may say to yourself, Brian, what the hell are you talking about? There's tons of awareness of domestic violence, especially now. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. This is what I'm more talking about.
Sending emergency.
My mommy having a fight.
What's the matter? Hello?
That is the opening scene of a documentary that we did a couple years ago. And that scene always triggers emotion. I get emotional when I see it still. But what that scene also triggers is a question, no matter where we screen it. And that question is, what was that? And in particular, from that girl's standpoint, from the little girl, what would she call it? Because I know her, and today she's 29. And when she was little, she didn't know what to call it. And she really didn't know what to call it even a couple of years ago. You may say to yourself, well, that's domestic violence. But I can tell you, after studying domestic violence, the words that come to mind when you ask people in general, domestic violence, what comes to mind, the words are women, abuse, violence, beating. Children are not mentioned. Childhood is not mentioned. You may say physical child abuse. Look, in these households, 50% of the time, in 50% of these houses, child abuse happens too. But most people, when they think of child abuse, they think of physical child abuse. And if you listen, she wasn't touched that night. You may say like emotional or verbal abuse. I call that non-physical violence. Most people who experience this, they don't even like these words. Yes, that happened, but there's something more. Sometimes people just say, oh, we're just dysfunctional. They just lump it into dysfunctional, right? Like the same family who says, grandma sits at Thanksgiving and has gas and talks to herself. They may say that's dysfunctional, and then they lump this into dysfunctional. No, it's way more than that too. Researchers will call it quipive. Have you ever heard of quipive? Mentioned that to someone last week and they said, I hope I don't catch it. Quipive is child witness to intimate partner violence. Child witness to intimate partner violence. Maybe some of you have heard that word. I can tell you that less than 1% of the population has ever heard of that. And then we've got this word, witness. I don't know about you, maybe some of you grew up in this home. But when I talk to people who grew up in these homes, and people like me, we have a problem with the word witness because the word witness doesn't adequately describe the impact. So the reality is that a lot of people aren't sure really what to call it, even the ones who experienced it. As a matter of fact, we as a society are not even sure that we should be searching for it. And you say, what are you talking about? I asked a friend of mine who is really well known, he's really skilled at digital media, like online stuff. And I asked him, has there ever been a time in recent history where the term domestic violence has been more popular? I mean, with everything going on with the NFL? He said, I don't know, let me check. So he looked at Google for the past 2 years every day and searched the number of times that someone searched the word domestic violence. And he charted it. And guess what? We're right. You see that big spike over here in September? That's this year. There's never been a time where more people have been searching for information on domestic violence. And that chart goes out when you look at other years. Do you want to see the chart when people search domestic violence and children or childhood or child? That search, do you want to see that chart? It's right there. That's that chart. The number of times that we search for the word domestic violence with either children or childhood or child or any of those words, it happens so infrequently, it doesn't even register. As a matter of fact, at the height, do you know how many searches there were? There were about 51 in a week, and I was probably 10 of them. Could that really be accurate? Really? When UNICEF says that this is one of the most pervasive human rights violations in the world today, impacting 275 million little kids. 10 to 15 million in the US alone. And let's not forget the adults who were those children. 725 million of us. 40 million in the US alone. That's 1 in 7.
What about those who have already grown up and left these homes? Many were raised at a time when it wasn't even acknowledged that parents could be damaging to a child. They've been left to struggle on their own, often too ashamed to share what happens with others. Because this issue's been under society's radar for so long, they often don't connect the dots between the issues they face growing up in their homes and the issues they face today. So while they may leave behind the violence of their childhood, they're not living the lives they want to lead today, because their perceptions of themselves and the way they relate to others are not as they would have them to be, and they're not aware of it.
What about those adults who left those childhood homes? I mean, we're adults, for sure we should be able to figure this out by now. No, another reason why there's such a low awareness, Renee is one of the leading researchers in the world. We're too ashamed, it's under society's radar, right? We don't connect the dots between the issues that we have today and the issues that we had in childhood. Many of us get away from the violence, but we still may be able to live a life that wasn't anything like it was supposed to be. One of the leading researchers in the world, and the 3 other ones would say the same thing. I mean, just by being able to name something, you can calm the emotional circuitry in the brain, just by knowing what to call it. So I asked myself, like a few years ago, like 3 years ago, you know, who names things? Who names things? And I thought about that, and I said, hey, marketers name things. And I work with these people. I built businesses in this space. I know these people. So I said, why don't you all come to New York, 20 of you? And we went to this hotel. Some of the best marketers in the country, big brands. We sat around this table, and we thought about it for 2 straight days, Friday and Saturday. And we thought about, how could we make this a little easier to talk about? And you know what we came up with? Nothing. Nothing. 2 days. 2 days, 20 people, brilliant minds, researchers in the room. Some were really uncomfortable to talk about it. Some never realized that they grew up in one of these homes. A couple people left. The next morning, one of them called me and said, Brian, you know, I'm really frustrated by this. I can't believe we didn't come up with anything. I'm wondering, maybe if you could get everybody back together again, because I'd fly back out again, and you could get us back together, and maybe if you were to start off the session and tell them, you know, what is it like for someone who was a child of domestic violence? What was it like? And I said, what'd you say, Carl? And he said, you know, what was it like to be a child of domestic violence? And I said, you know, Carl, I'd never really heard those words before, but as I think about it, yeah, that's what I was. That's what I was. That's what my mother was. That's what her boyfriend was. That's what my grandmother was. That's what my grandfather was. My father was in jail, so I'm not sure what he was. And then we started looking, this idea of child of domestic violence. Then we did some research, and we found that people in different parts of the world call it childhood domestic violence. I was like, wow, that's interesting language. And then we tested that. And while, yes, domestic violence means this, when you test it with consumers, what happens is remarkable. When you begin to look at it through the eyes of childhood, what winds up happening now is the words that we think about change. Now people think about children and hope and reaching out and caring. And you know, maybe this would make it a little easier. I don't know about you, but I remember in the 70s, a couple of my relatives, one in particular, came down with breast cancer. And I was told that you don't talk about that. That was viewed as shameful. We don't talk about that. Can anybody relate to this? Yes, you don't talk about that. Don't talk about breast cancer. We talk about it now. I mean, it's even on NFL Sundays, for goodness sakes. Ray Rice even wears pink. You know what, though, about Ray? I wonder, because if you grow up living with domestic violence, you experienced childhood domestic violence. And from a childhood standpoint, domestic violence is violence between your parents or violence towards a parent, perhaps from a significant other or a step-parent. And this violence can be physical or non-physical. I only started talking to my mother about this about 4 years ago. And the only reason I talked to her about it was because her doctor took me out in the hallway and said that she has a 3% chance to live the next 6 months. Why is it that we can only talk about it when they die? Why can we only talk about this issue when our parents die? Is it that we feel like we're shaming them, we're outing them, we're saying something that we shouldn't be talking about, it's just so uncomfortable, so don't bother? Well, I talked to her, I said, Ma, you know, I really want to write this book, and I need to talk to you about it. And she said, oh, all right. She said, but I really don't want to talk to you, I'll talk to someone else. So I had someone interview her who was helping me with the book. And they did it over the phone. But I got to listen because I was on mute on the phone. So the first question that the guy asked, he said, Marilyn, can you tell me a little bit about your childhood? And she said, oh, it was violent. And I'm on mute, right? And I'm like, Ma, no. He's talking about your childhood, not mine. And then she went on to talk. And I listened. And she said, you know, I would go to bed, and every time I would go to bed, I would hate going to bed because I was always anxious. I was worried what was going to happen that night. And I'd go into my bedroom, and I wouldn't go to sleep. I'd sometimes pinch myself in my legs so I would stay awake. And then all of a sudden, I would hear them start to argue. And then I had to decide, am I gonna go out tonight? Because maybe I'll look at the window, look at the door, and I'll look and I'll wait, and maybe I'll go out tonight. But when I go out, I get hurt. But when I stay here, it hurts more because I feel like I should be going out. And I can't help him anyway. But then she went on, and I was crying because it was as though it was my own child listening to this. I had no idea that she experienced the same thing that I experienced, but there was one difference between what she experienced and what I experienced. What she said was, even in a home where she experienced CDV, where she experienced physical child abuse, what she said on the phone to that guy was, I really do believe that my life would have been so different if they just didn't use those words to tell me who I would never be. And those were words that she never said to me. Non-physical has as much of an impact here. And by the way, it doesn't need to last forever. Research is pretty clear here that even a brief experience at a key time in development alters the brain. A friend of mine, Jeremy, who's in the book, he's a good friend of mine, he grew up with, a lot of violence in his home. Certainly grew up with CDV. And one day his father boy just came to him and just with all his force, just with his words, just talked to just the things he said to him. And Jeremy said, you know one day I'm going to kill you, right? You know that, right? The father took 2 steps back, was like stunned, walked out of the house, never came back. Never came back. You know how old Jeremy was? Jeremy was 6. So what I'm saying here is it doesn't need to last long because we're only conscious at like 4.5. Now, do you think it ended? No. Jeremy started training. Jeremy joined the Navy so he could train to know how to kill his father. He became a Navy SEAL. You know what percent of naval cadets grew up living with domestic violence? 51%. So he's all ready to go. His break is coming up. He's got a month coming up where he has a leave. He's all set to go. And then he gets called into the chaplain's office. And the chaplain says, Jeremy, I'm so sorry. Your father has passed away. Where's all that rage going to go? Because you know, the deepest secret that a man will never reveal is that when he was a young boy, he was not able to protect the most important woman in his life. Where's that rage going to go? What is the impact on someone like that? What's the impact on someone like Jeremy or me or you or people you're thinking about in your head as you're listening to this, or my mother or grandfather or any of them? What's the impact? Well, there are a number of impacts, but one of them that you got to know is true is that it negatively wires the developing brain. It literally encodes a series of negative beliefs that we then grow up to believe. And I never knew this about the brain. I just learned it a couple years ago. You may know this. I didn't know this. But the brain has like two jobs. First job is to keep us alive. The second job is to find evidence of what it believes is true. That's how the brain works. So let me give you an example. If you're Jeremy or me, or any of the people you're thinking of, or you, and you grew up and you were young and you really believed that, you know, I have to stop it. There's something I can do. There's something I can do to stop this. There's something I should do to stop this. In some way, it's happening because of it. In some way, it's my fault. There's something different that I can do so it doesn't happen tomorrow. Or maybe you didn't know what to believe, so you just defaulted to, holy, there just must be something wrong with me. And all your life, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, the brain seeks to find evidence of what it believes is true. No wonder why we're guilty. No wonder why we blame. No wonder why it can't be our fault because it's been our fault for so long. No wonder why we feel shame. And then, as human beings, we act and feel, right, in accordance to what we believe is true. And sometimes when we act and feel in what we believe is true, those actions are tragic. And those actions take us down a path where we're nowhere near our full potential. And our life's over and it's like, what the hell happened? But some of them never make it. Because we're 6 times more likely to commit suicide. So many people who grew up in these homes aren't even here with us today in this room because they fell. We're 50 times more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, be addicted to drugs and alcohol. I always wondered why there was so much in my house, so much stuff like this. And then I came upon this definition of happiness. And the definition said, happiness is when your thoughts are pleasant most of the time. I know my mother's and her boyfriends weren't. Drugs and alcohol maybe temporarily help with that. I'm 74 times more likely to be violent, and I have been. 90% of prisoners came from these homes. But we also have to ask ourselves, what if you're not? Like you in particular, what if you grew up in one of these homes? What about if you know someone who did? What about if you're thinking about some of the people who you've come in contact with? What if they're not any of these things, right? What if they're not dead? What if they didn't take their own life? What if they're not in jail at this moment in time? What if they're not addicted beyond repair? What if they're not being violent at this moment? Then what happened? Maybe they certainly heard of post-traumatic stress, right? We've all heard of that. But you know what else is true? And I've seen it, and you've probably seen it too. There's also post-traumatic growth. So maybe, yes, while people who grow up in these homes, they say we're going to have a hard time with relationships. That's true, yes. And I know you know this, that the best predictor of whether you're going to be in one of these relationships is whether or not you grew up living with it. Of course. And we do struggle in mind and actions to be the best parents that we can if you grew up in one of these homes. You got to ask yourself. You have to ask the people that you know, that you care about, that you come into contact with. Yes, these are struggles, but if you've already overcome some of the toughest ones, meaning you haven't taken your own life, you're not in jail, you're not addicted beyond repair, you're not being violent at this moment in time, maybe there's something in you that you can pull from to overcome these as well. Maybe there is this idea of this post-traumatic growth that you can pull from. And then you may say, you know, those who tap into post-traumatic growth is just that some are strong and some are weak. No, that's not true. I'll tell you what happened. And the research is pretty clear on this. The pathway to resiliency for anyone who grows up in one of these homes is what you do every day. For these young people, even young adults, even adults, someone stepped in, someone who cares, and helped them unlearn one of those negative beliefs, help them unlearn one of those lies. I was talking to one of you yesterday on the phone, and I won't say your name, but you said to me that, you know, sometimes when I talk to these, I go into I'll go in and I'll see a kid, and maybe I'll say something to him or her, but they don't even look at me. They don't even respond. Sometimes they look at me as though they're pissed. You don't need a reaction from them to know that you're having an impact, because guess who didn't respond either? I just sat there in a shell, but I was listening. The pathway to resiliency is when one person steps in and shares a truth they can't see, because the children can't see it. The young people can't see it. Even the young adults can't see it. You know, I hear you. I believe you. You need to know you're not alone. Understand that it's never a child's job to control the actions of an adult. Words that we can share, words that have impact. This is what separates those who are resilient from those who are not. But maybe that's just like one of the lies and one of the truths. What if there was more to unlearn? Because after all, the fellow who wrote this book, and he said to me, and I'll never forget when he said this, he said, Brian, if you grew up in one of these homes, I'm telling you, you will not reach your full potential in life unless you unlearn all that was learned. But how can we unlearn it if we don't even know what to call it? What if someone were to share with you those truths for yourself, for the people that you care about, for those who you come in contact with? What if they shared with you all of those truths? Because we're not guilty. And I keep this on my neck, this little pendant that I made to remind me of them. And I remind myself of them every day, because at times that's what it takes. I'm not guilty. We're not guilty. It's never a child's job to control the actions of an adult. You didn't choose what home you were put into. As a matter of fact, the more people who know what type of home I grew up in, they knew that I struggled when I was little, they actually think more of me. Not that it matters what people think, but when you realize this, they can actually begin to feel free. We're not resentful. We resent what happened. We may resent the people who did it, but we're not resentful. You can't have compassion for others until we have compassion for ourselves. How can we have compassion for ourselves if we didn't even know what to call it, if we didn't even know it had an impact? Now that we have compassion for ourselves, we can have it for other people. Only those who have suffered truly understand suffering. And we want to take it away. We're not sad people. A sad thing happened. We lost our childhood. But we're not sad people. As a matter of fact, we're really grateful because we can actually sleep through the night. We're grateful because we're out of that home. We're not alone. There are more of us than we ever could have possibly figured out. There are a billion of us. One big family all struggling together. But if you can't trust yourself, then you can't trust others. And if you don't know yourself, how can you trust yourself? Now as we begin to know ourselves more, we can be more trusting of ourselves. That means we can be more trusting of others. And we're not angry people. We're angry maybe at what happened, but we're not angry type people. Let me tell you something. We learned a lie, and the lie is this: that anger is a good tool to use to teach others a lesson so they do what I want them to do. But how's that worked? Doesn't work for me. As a matter of fact, whenever I use anger or any type of violence, especially towards someone that I love, afterwards it comes back and it just stabs me. And I launch terrible sadness. But what I've also realized from talking to so many people who have done it is that there's a way you can take that energy that anger produces, because it produces a great energy, right? And you can take it and move it towards the thing with which you are most passionate about in life, the thing that you most want. You can use that energy. You know who did that, by the way? Jeremy did that. That's where his rage went. It could have went into a real bad place, but it didn't. It went here. We're not hopeless. Things are not hopeless. We are actually guided, because we were guided out of that house because we had a purpose in life. And we can be guided to do that same thing now. All we have to do is choose what it is. We're not worth less. This is a big one. Worth less than others. Of course, because this didn't happen to other people, right? So it happened to me, I've got to be worth less. Let me ask something. What obstacle could possibly compare now in adulthood when you think about a child who grows up in one of these homes and comes out of that? What obstacle can possibly compare in life? We're more accomplished than we know. We're not fearful people. It took me a while to realize this. It was only about 7 years ago, right when I started doing all this, that I was honest enough to finally have a conversation with someone, because I never shared this with anybody. And I shared it with a stranger, and it was another man, and I said to him, let me tell you something. I am so weak. I have no confidence. I'm the most cowardly person. Fear stops me all the time. And I explained why it all happened. And if I was man enough, I would have killed him. I would have gotten rid of it. It wouldn't have happened time and time again. That's how weak I am. I can't even protect the woman who created me. That's how afraid I am. And he looked at me like, he said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, look, I grew up in a really peaceful household. I grew up in a normal house. I can't even imagine growing up in a house like that for a minute. I can't imagine my kids sleeping over your house for one day. What could you possibly be afraid of now? What fear could possibly compare? And then I teared, but I didn't cry. I teared, one of those tears that when you blink, everything becomes clearer, because I realized that I was more confident than I knew. We're not self-conscious, but let me tell you something. If you believe, you believe all these things about yourself, you can't possibly, when you look in the mirror, see what everybody else sees. As we begin to unlearn them, we can actually look and say, oh, we're more attractive than we knew. And lastly, we're not, for a child who grows up in one of these homes, as they grow into adulthood, they feel as though they were unloved. And it's a great gift to be an adult and to have grown up in one of these homes, because you don't need a whole lot of love in your life to feel it, because the bar was so low. My kids are going to have a tough time. They're really loved. I don't know who the hell is going to love them anymore. They're going to have a tough time. But we don't have a tough time. And on top of it, as we learn the truths, and the real secret is this: as we give these feelings away to others who need them as much as we do, the feelings that we give away without the expectation of return, that's loving. These are the gifts that were given in return for the price that we paid in childhood. Now, as we learn them, we can now become the one thing for another that they never had, because this was never talked about. But imagine if we could begin sharing them with other people now. Imagine if we share them with ourselves and with those closest to us. You may ask, what else can we do? I can tell you the greatest change that I see happen is when you ask this question to someone who you care about. Because this question, as simple as it is, has not been asked or answered. It is a trigger for so much. They don't even know what to call it. It is childhood domestic violence. What else can we do? We can stay in touch. I would love to stay in touch with you. I have more of an respect for what you do than you know. I think also you're going to get a sample of this book. Everything that I'm talking about is in this book. All the money goes back to the foundation. All of it is nonprofit. But you're going to get a copy of just the first few chapters with some of this information to the extent you want to learn more. And oh, by the way, the title Invincible, the definition of invincible is unable to be conquered. And I thought of that title because even, my mother grew up in one of these homes, right? But even that cancer that said there was a 3% chance that she'd live, that couldn't even take her down. So she's alive right now and doing very well. And she's unlearned many of the lies that she's learned, living the life that she was always meant to lead. And if you read this, you'll notice that the introduction was written by Tony Robbins. He's a good friend, and he's also on our board. And he wrote the introduction, and he also has a message that he wanted to share with you in the form of a summary.
Sending emergency.
My mommy is having a fight.
I never talked about it. Literally for decades, I never spoke a word about it. The fact that I grew up in a home environment that had extreme domestic violence. Globally, UNICEF calls it one of the most pervasive human rights violations in the world today. It affects 1 billion people worldwide. Look, it's one thing to have physical pain, that can heal, but spiritual pain, the pain of those you love, hurting themselves, hurting each other, or hurting you, lives deep inside your subconscious. And if you let it, it'll define your self-concept. It leaves an indelible mark. When you grow up living in domestic violence where you're witnessing those you love tearing each other down physically and with verbal blows every day, or if you experience those blows yourself, it alters you. Your brain doesn't know how to deal with it. It wounds the mind, the psyche, and the spirit. But one thing is true. Only those who've experienced extreme pain have extreme strength. What we went through left us with vast inner reserves of strength, of flexibility, of compassion, and courage. You had to have it to get through those days. And those are the very gifts that we've got in exchange for the price we paid in our childhood. That really means that the moment we're no longer willing to be victims, that's the moment our life starts to become victorious. These truths, when shared, unlock an avalanche of untapped potential in any human being. Out of so much pain and injustice, something great must come, and it does. The moment we refocus and we take action and we really move ourselves forward, the potential is inside of you right now. I want you to embrace your gifts and the truths of your life. It's time to share, to speak the truth, to live the truth. The courageous men and women you'll meet in this book have felt that pain and they've overcome it. They've learned a way of life that's based on contribution, inner strength, and love. This path is available to you right now. The roadmap is here. Let the journey begin.
And, the key thing to keep in mind here is that really we are not victims. We are victorious. Thank you very much.